Welcome back to the Fullerton College Printing Department, and this is Ben Hewitt, your instructor for prepress. We're taking a look at the second half, I hope, the second half of the PIA's Prepress Training Manual, Section 5.3, Press Considerations. Today we're going to talk about printing plates and their effect on what you can and can't do, and how they physically limit and sometimes physically enable. Let's be real here. A ladder can either be blocking your exit or it can be a way of reaching a way out. It's all how you look at it. It may be a hindrance or it may be a tool. Anyways, so the printing plate and how does it affect our output? The plate is what carries, it's called the plate carrier. It's called not plate carrier. That's something else, guys. The plate is called an image carrier because it carries the image to the paper. What it does is it is coated with chemical coatings that are then ablated off by laser or other methods. Typically, they're photosensitive. There are other ways of doing it. Some parts like ink, some parts like water. The water parts that get all nice and wet with the dampening solution, which is a slightly acidic mixture of water and a few other things in it, more or less a root beer, as I like to think of it as, because that's about the level of acidity that it has. Root beer. Still not great to splash in your eyes or anything, but not the worst stuff to work with either. Anyways, so the dampening system gets the plate it gets it wet and it absorbs water onto its surface, the parts that like water. The parts that don't like water are kind of oily and they repel the water because, as we all know from kindergarten, oil and water don't mix, not easily. So the plate, using the repulsion of water to oil, determines what text, graphics, and images show up when you print it. Typically speaking, they are aluminum or aluminum alloy covered with this photosensitive emulsion. And the emulsion is what makes the hydrophilic and oleophilic, the parts that like the water and the parts that like the oil, and control the printing process. Remember, this can be ridiculously accurate. It's not that simple, but the properties of oil and water not liking each other is so granular and gets to such a small, precise point that you can have multiple thousands of dots per inch, all controlled by oil and water not liking each other. They really don't like each other. So, plate terminology. Hydrophilic is water-loving. Quick side note, hydrophobic means you don't like water. And historically speaking, that was another phrase for having rabies. That dog's hydrophobic because one of the symptoms of having rabies is not liking water. I thought I'd throw that in there just for the heck of it. Anyways, I swear I don't have rabies. So the hydrophilic area likes water. That repels the oily inks, and that is very important for controlling where the ink doesn't go. The oleophilic, ink-loving, oil-loving area, that section attracts oil. The oily ink sticks to it, but does not stick to the water. It repels the water and only attracts the ink. So here's the cylinders. You got your plate cylinder, your blanket cylinder, your impression cylinder. Those are the three main cylinders of at least a sheet-fed offset press. A lot of time the web presses will do something a little bit different. We'll look at that in a minute. But anyways, the plate cylinder holds the plate. The printing plate that we made on a big sheet of aluminum gets wrapped around the cylinder and clamped into place. So it's wrapped around the roller. It's not technically a roller. Rollers mean something else in this. The other cylinder is the blanket cylinder, which has a rubber coating on it. Actually, it's a removable rubber coating that they call the blanket because it's kind of like a big sheet of rubber. It's kind of like a blanket. And that presses against the plate cylinder. The plate cylinder, the water and the ink both on it, print onto the blanket. And the blanket is what prints to the paper. This is also why it's called offset printing, because the plate is offset from the substrate. The plate and the paper never touch. At least they shouldn't. If the plate and the paper ever touch, something has gone wrong, and have fun cleaning that up. But anyways, the plate cylinder prints to the blanket, and the blanket prints to the impression cylinder. The impressions are, whoops, I messed that up again too. You should not be printing on the impression cylinder. That means you're printing with no paper in the press, and that's bad juju. You don't want to get ink on there. That then means you're getting printing onto the back sides of your papers. But the impression cylinder gives enough pressure to push the paper against the blanket. So the plate has to be big enough to go all the way around that plate cylinder and have a little bit of extra to bend into a little slot on the, we'll call it the top. In the picture, it's kind of near the top. It's on a rolling cylinder, so it's only at the top when it's rotated that way. Silly Ben. Anyways, the plate has a plate bend where the plate bends around the corner and into that little trough where it's going to have clamps on it, the head clamp and the tail clamp. The head clamp just means you clamp that one first, and the tail clamp means after you wrapped it around, you clamp the last bit there, and it tightens in to hold it firmly, securely, and snugly all the way around that cylinder. The plate bend, here's a photo of it. You can see the plate bends around that edge there, is a non-image area. And while it's an extra plate, you're thinking about the tacks that you can't use. That just helps you know that the plate size does not determine the image size directly. Kind of how the paper size does not determine the printable size. The paper size minus the stuff you trim off and the stuff you have to leave for the machines to hold it and any other targets and bars you had to print in the margins, then you get to use what's left over. This is saying that not only that, but if you're going to make a plate, the plate has to be bigger than the press sheet because the plate has to have space for the clamps to hold it to the press and spaces to bend in for those clamps to hold it. And all that area is unusable for printing. It's all necessary to make the print happen, but you don't get to print from that space. So understand that the plate size still has to, as I like to say, it has to pay its taxes before you get the take-home net pay there, or gross pay, whatever's net, whatever's left, the net weight, whatever's left and remains for you to use is what did not get bent away. And physically speaking, you're not going to be able to print on the plate bed because that literally bends away from pressing. When it rolls, this part of the press rolls across that blanket, it doesn't touch anything. There's no impression in that section. So don't think you can get away with that. Now, web presses, I was saying they do things a little bit differently. And I want you just for a moment, as you're looking at this picture, ignore all those little blue and red circles, the ones that are talking about the inking and dampening rollers, because that's going to confuse you from what you're seeing. Let's go back for a second here. You see on the sheet fed press, you have a plate cylinder, a blanket cylinder, and an impression cylinder. And the impression cylinder pushes against the blanket to give that pressure. When you come to a web fed press, if you're ignoring those other colors, you see the main cylinders. The plate cylinder goes to the blanket cylinder, just like on the sheet fed, except instead of that impression cylinder giving you the pressure you need to transfer ink, you've got another press unit upside down going up from underneath. You have a blanket and a plate below printing up. Because if you think about it, on a sheet fed press, you can flip that paper over and print it a second time and do the backside, right? It can't exactly do that, and you certainly can't do that accurately with giant webs of paper. If you're printing on a giant car-sized roll, yes, car-sized, probably a Volkswagen Bug. People always compare things to Volkswagens as a standard size. So imagine a roll of paper the size of a Volkswagen being loaded up onto a press. You're not going to take that off and flip it over and print the backside, are you? That's dangerous to do, even to try and flip that end over end. Dangerous to the people operating it and dangerous to the paper itself. You could drop it and dent it and damage hundreds of prints all at once. Anyways, so this, in my 101 class, we call this a perfecting press. This means you're printing both sides at once. So again, instead of an impression cylinder pushing back, you have another half of a press unit pushing back. So it's printing both sides at once. Pretty cool, right? So anyways, each unit has upper cylinders and lower cylinders. So for on a web press, especially a large newspaper press that is printing both sides at once, and you have a 4-color press, you're talking not 4 press units, but really 8. Because you have the bottom and the top of each one both pressing against blanket to blanket. Web plates clamp in a gap. They also have a gap similar to the sheet fed plates. You have to have a place where it goes in. They call it a gap on this. So the area you can print on is the area that's on the outside of the circle, not on the area where it's bent into the gap. Very similar to the sheet fed press, isn't it? Web fed has something called cutoff because nobody buys a giant roll the size of a Volkswagen of newspapers. It'd be really hard for paper boys to carry that up and down the street screaming extra, extra, extra while singing some snappy songs about poor worker treatment. Wait, that's Newsies. Anyways, the cutoff is where you cut it, where you also call it sheeting sometimes, where you take your huge roll of paper and you cut it down into individual sheets once it's done being printed. Very few people buy paper. You don't sell news scrolls, you sell news papers. So it's going to be, even if it was a scroll, be cut off at some point. The cutoff can be in line or it can be done later on offline. But either way, it's the length of the sheet that exits the web press is determined by that. And it's always the same as the plate cylinder's circumference. So every time you go, I'm going to go back to this picture for you. Every time you go around that cylinder one time, all the way around the circle, then you cut it off because it's going to repeat itself. Every time it goes around that surface, all the way around the cylinder, you're going to cut it off because it repeats itself. See what I did there? Yeah, I have 2 kids. I can do dad jokes. I have a license to pun. Be warned. So here's a good picture of the cutoff. So you can see this is actually, and oftentimes this is true on those large Volkswagen-sized papers you're loading onto the web presses. It prints wider than it does long. So you're gonna end up with a really wide paper. The cutoff length is only the 23 inches you can see there. It's the circumference of the plate cylinder. The maximum print is a little bit smaller than the cutoff length because you're always paying those taxes. There's always that edge you can't use. Sorry, guys, you never get to use the whole paper. I know in kindergarten, when you're coloring the page and drawing pictures, the teacher always encourages use the whole paper. Don't draw small, make it big, use the whole paper. Well, I'm here to come back and tell my kindergarten teacher. First off, Mrs. Dowell, you are a very nice lady and I had a great time in your class all those decades ago. But also, I literally cannot use the whole paper. I have to cut bits off. I'm very sorry. I know you want me to, but I can't. Anyways, so the printable image is never the full size of the cutoff. It's a little bit smaller. Imposition is when you show up unannounced at your friend's house. They're like, it's dinner time. I guess I get to feed him. Wait, wrong kind of imposition. No one expects the Spanish imposition. Our weapons are surprised. No, not that one either. The imposition is, in fact, the way of arranging multiple sheets onto one or both sides of a larger press sheet. Only amateurs and home printers are people who will print one thing per page. Come on, it's not amateur hour. We can print multiple things per page. We're here to get as much as we can out of our paper to make Mrs. Dowell proud again here. We're not trying to just waste paper. In fact, we're trying to get multiple sheets out of one sheet, multiple finished products out of one sheet, because it's really efficient. Anyways, imposition is putting multiple sheets onto it. The easiest ways to think about it is like a gang up. We're going to talk about the different types, but the easiest one to think of is, honestly, you're just taking, if you're printing business cards, which are standard in the US is 3.5 inches by 2 inches. That is significantly smaller than even an 8.5 by 11. Even if your press is only printing letter size paper and you're printing 3.5 by 2 inches, don't you think you can get more than one business card on a letter size paper? If not, we'll arrange a special meeting for me and you to talk, and I will explain it to you, because this is one of those fundamentals of pre-press. We want to get as many things on that paper as possible. Like how my wife brings in things from the car. She doesn't want to walk back to the car more than once from the house. She wants to bring it all in one trip. And that's the right attitude for printing. We don't want to print 12 pages to print 12 copies. Not when we can get 12 copies on one page. Efficiency. Get as much as you can out of it. Always try to get that one extra on there if you can. That'll make your boss and your clients happy. Even if you're your own boss, well then, hey, you're making yourself happy. Later on, we get into task 6. We have an entire chapter on just imposition. But here's the phrases. There's sheetwise, work and turn, work and tumble, multi-up, and combination. Sheetwise is that rare exception when you do print just one per sheet. Think like printing posters. If you're printing a big poster, you're going to print a poster to the maximum size that press can handle, minus, of course, your taxes where you have to cut off the edges and make it full bleed, et cetera, et cetera. But sheetwise is one image, one side, one sheet, done. It's the Highlander way of doing it. There can only be one. Work and turn and work and tumble are a way of printing the front and back of the same thing on one sheet. So instead of having to print making 2 sets of plates, if you fit 2 postcards into one sheet of paper or more, print front and back on the same side, flip it over, print it again, and you've got both sides. Work and tumble is the exact same thing, except you flip the paper across a different axis. Work and turn, you maintain the side guide or the gripper edge. Work and tumble, you flip over it and you change from one side to the other is where you're measuring. Multi-up is when you put more than one business card on a sheet or more than one postcard or more than one book. And combination is, well, a combination, isn't it? Thank you guys for listening. Thanks for being in our class. It's good to talk about this stuff. Hopefully you're finding this helpful. This is Ben signing off.